What if the most important events in our history were the ones we never learned about? It's a question that sounds almost paranoid until you begin to uncover what lies beneath the pages of official textbooks and patriotic narratives. Stories that never made it into school lessons, not because they were disproven, but because someone decided we shouldn't remember them at all. There's something haunting about collective silence. It's not just the absence of facts. It's the quiet that follows when questions are never asked. Throughout the 20th century and beyond, governments, institutions, and entire systems have carefully managed which truths are preserved and which are buried. It's not a conspiracy. It's a pattern. And it's a pattern that reveals more about power and memory than we may be ready to admit. In this series, we invite you to look again at history not as a set of agreed-upon facts, but as a living puzzle, shaped as much by what's forgotten as by what's remembered. Our journey begins in the shadows of the Great Depression, in a moment when democracy in the United States stood on a knife's edge, not from foreign enemies, but from some of its most powerful citizens. 1933. America is struggling. The economic crash has gutted families. Banks have collapsed, and a new president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, is trying to rebuild the country with radical ideas that frighten Wall Street. Behind closed doors, a plot is taking shape, one that reads like fiction. But it's not. A cabal of bankers, industrialists, and corporate elites, enraged by the New Deal, develop a plan to remove Roosevelt from office and replace him with a government of their own design, not through elections, through a coup. They seek to install a decorated Marine Corps general, beloved by veterans and the public alike, as the figurehead of their new regime. He's their perfect candidate, trusted, patriotic, and charismatic. But they make a fatal mistake. They think he'll say yes. Instead, he listens to their pitch and then quietly walks out of the room and straight into Congress. There, in testimony under oath, he details the entire plot. Names, documents, meetings, and the committee investigating him confirms his story. Not a rumor, not speculation, a verified conspiracy, and then silence. No arrests, no trials, no headlines. The story is buried, the documents sealed, the history books remain blank. Why? What does it mean when democracy survives not because of justice, but because of a single act of conscience, and then forgets the danger ever existed? How do we come to terms with the idea that history is curated, not complete? This is not a series about cynicism. It's about reckoning. About looking back not to assign blame, but to understand how power operates when no one is watching. It's about voices, silenced, dismissed, or forgotten, and what happens when we choose to hear them again. Each episode will take you deeper into a moment where the official story diverges from what really happened. We'll begin with Wall Street's forgotten coup, move through secret war plans, erased massacres, and medical experiments hidden from public view. These stories are difficult, but they are necessary, because history isn't just what happened, it's what we choose to remember. So let's begin. It started with a meeting in a hotel room, quiet, polished, unremarkable, the kind of place where deals are made over bourbon and cigars. But in this room in 1933, the conversation wasn't about business. It was about taking over the United States government. The country was unraveling. Bread lines stretched around corners, farms were failing, and desperation clung to every town like dust. Roosevelt had just launched the New Deal, a sweeping set of reforms designed to rescue the economy and redistribute power. To the average American, it was hope. To the wealthy elite, it was war. The plotters were not fringe radicals. They were men at the very heart of American industry. Banking dynasties, chemical magnates, arms manufacturers, titans of finance. They feared Roosevelt's policies would weaken their grip, so they devised a plan to end his presidency, not with ballots, but with force. They called it the business plot. The idea was simple but staggering. They would raise a private army, 500,000 strong, composed largely of disgruntled World War I veterans. The leader? A retired Marine Corps general with a spotless reputation and the loyalty of soldiers across the country. His name was Smedley Butler. They approached him with quiet confidence, promised funding, influence, even a new role as the leader of a so-called constitutional government. But Butler didn't flinch. Instead, he listened, took notes, and then turned the entire operation in. What followed was one of the most astonishing and quickly forgotten moments in American history. In 1934, Butler testified before Congress, laying bare the plot. He had names, letters, financial records, and a witness, an investment broker who had acted as the liaison. The evidence was overwhelming. The House Un-American Activities Committee confirmed that there had indeed been an attempt to establish a fascist regime in the United States. But then, the record fades. No arrests were made, no charges filed. Newspapers downplayed the hearings. Some buried the story entirely. The very institutions that were supposed to protect the Republic, law enforcement, media, even the justice system, chose silence. Or perhaps they were told to be silent. Butler, for his part, faded into obscurity. His warnings, his courage, largely ignored by the history books. Only decades later, when suppressed documents were released, did the scope of the conspiracy become undeniably clear. And yet, still, most Americans have never heard of it. We tell ourselves that democracies fall with fanfare, with tanks in the streets or mobs at the gates. But sometimes they falter in hotel rooms, over polished tables, with handshakes and whispered promises. What does it mean that our system survived not through institutional strength, but because one man chose to speak instead of obey? In an age where influence is purchased and narratives are curated, Butler's stand reminds us of something rare, the weight of individual conscience. And it leaves us with a quiet, unsettling question. If the plan had succeeded, would we have ever known it happened at all? What if the war you remember never happened the way you were told? The year was 1962. The Cold War was ice-thick with fear. In shadowy conference rooms deep inside the Pentagon, America's highest-ranking military officers drafted a plan. Not to defeat an enemy abroad, but to deceive their own people. They called it Operation Northwoods. The proposal was meticulous, chillingly calculated. It outlined a series of violent events designed to look like Cuban aggression, acts of terrorism, sabotage, and even civilian casualties on American soil. False flag attacks. The purpose? To manufacture justification for an all-out invasion of Cuba. It wasn't the idea of a rogue agent. It was endorsed by every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military body in the United States. One scenario involved blowing up a U.S. ship and blaming it on Cuban saboteurs. Another suggested orchestrating fake hijackings. There were even plans to simulate or cause real civilian deaths. One proposal coldly stated, casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. This wasn't war strategy, it was theater. The script, fear. The stage, America. But the plan never came to life, not because it was illegal, but because President Kennedy said no. Horrified by what he read, he rejected the proposal outright. Not long after, he began working to replace the Joint Chiefs chairman, the man who had spearheaded the operation. Then the documents disappeared. For decades, Operation Northwoods remained a ghost, mentioned in whispers, dismissed as rumor. It wasn't until 1997, more than 35 years later, that the plan surfaced again, pried from government archives by a persistent researcher through the Freedom of Information Act. The papers were real, The signatures were real, the intentions were undeniable. And still, the public barely noticed. This is the paradox of hidden history. Even when the truth emerges, it struggles to find its place in the light. We're taught to see our institutions as guardians, not gamblers. The idea that leaders might stage violence against their own people to serve a political goal feels unthinkable. But documents don't lie. Operation Northwoods wasn't carried out, but the mindset, the readiness to manipulate perception, to engineer outrage, didn't vanish. If anything, it evolved. We often imagine truth as a fixed point, something uncovered and set free. But truth, like history, is fragile. It can be suppressed. It can be delayed. It can be lost in plain sight. And so we're left to ask, if a plan to kill Americans to justify war was not only conceived, but approved, what else was imagined? What else remains, sealed in boxes, waiting for a future that may never ask the right questions? It began with a single spark. Then the sky turned black. May 31st, 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Greenwood District stood proud, a beacon of black prosperity in a segregated America. Nicknamed Black Wall Street, it was home to lawyers, doctors, entrepreneurs. Brick schools, jazz clubs, and elegant homes lined the streets. In a country that denied black citizens their rights, Greenwood built its own future. Then came the accusation. A young black man, a young white woman. No evidence, just rumor. By nightfall, mobs had formed. But this wasn't chaos. This was organized destruction. White rioters, deputized by local authorities, stormed into Greenwood armed with rifles and gasoline. They looted, they burned, they killed. Over 35 square blocks were reduced to ash. Private planes dropped incendiary devices from above, the first aerial bombing of civilians on American soil. Witnesses described machine gun fire, bodies in the streets, homes set ablaze with families still inside. When it ended, as many as 300 people were dead, 10,000 left homeless. The wealth of a generation erased in less than 24 hours. And then the silence began. Newspapers removed articles, police records vanished, survivors were threatened into silence. The dead were buried in unmarked mass graves. For nearly a century, textbooks ignored it. The word Tulsa became just another dot on a map. Officially, it was called a riot, as if the destruction was mutual, as if both sides had caused the fire. But the truth was something else entirely, a massacre enabled by the very institutions meant to uphold law and justice. No white person was ever charged. Insurance claims were denied. The city passed laws making it nearly impossible for survivors to rebuild. Much of the land was seized and repurposed. The message was clear. Not only would justice be denied, even memory would be stolen. It wasn't until the late 1990s that the truth clawed its way back into public awareness. Ground-penetrating radar revealed the outlines of mass graves. Survivors, now elderly, testified before commissions. Their stories were unwavering, their grief still raw. But the question remains, how does an atrocity of this scale vanish from the national conscience for 75 years? The answer is uncomfortable, because remembering would mean accountability. And accountability would mean reckoning with the systems that allowed it to happen. Not just the mob, but the media, the police, the city government, the state itself. History, we're told, is written by the victors, but sometimes it's rewritten by silence. And so Greenwood became a ghost until the silence was broken. The real legacy of Black Wall Street is not only in what was lost, but in what was kept alive by those who refused to forget. And now, a century later, the question lingers. What else has been erased beneath our feet, waiting for the ground to speak? It sounded like science fiction. It was something far darker. For over 2 decades, the CIA ran secret mind control experiments, not in secret military labs overseas, but inside American hospitals, universities, and prisons. Not on enemy combatants, but on unwitting citizens. They called it MK-Ultra. Officially launched in 1953, the program aimed to explore methods of controlling human behavior. The real agenda? To develop tools for interrogation, psychological warfare, and perhaps even creating programmed assassins. Behind the antiseptic doors of psychiatric wards and research centers, patients were subjected to chemical cocktails, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and extreme trauma, all without informed consent. LSD was a favorite tool. The agency believed the drug might unlock the secrets of the mind or break it completely. So they began slipping it to unsuspecting people, inmates, drug addicts, mental patients, even everyday citizens lured into CIA-funded brothels. One of the most disturbing chapters unfolded in Montreal, where patients seeking treatment for anxiety or depression were subjected to psychic driving, forced to listen to recorded messages on repeat for days while drugged, followed by electroshock therapy at 40 times the standard intensity. Many forgot their names, their families, how to eat, how to speak. None had consented. None were warned. In 1973, as Congress began probing CIA abuses, the agency destroyed the majority of MK-Ultra's records. Shredded, burned, gone. But a few boxes, misfiled under financial records, survived. Those fragments painted a terrifying picture. Over 149 sub-projects spread across 80 institutions, contracts with prestigious universities, partnerships with pharmaceutical companies, experiments on children, on soldiers, on those society wouldn't protect. When the story broke in the mid-1970s, the nation was stunned, but not for long. There were hearings, headlines, then the narrative faded. No prosecutions, no formal accountability. The survivors were left with scars and silence. We're told MK-Ultra ended in 1973. But documents suggest otherwise. Projects with similar objectives continued under different names, wrapped in deeper layers of secrecy. Even into the 1990s, federal investigations uncovered new evidence of unethical human experimentation under the guise of defense research. This wasn't a Cold War aberration. It was a philosophy that national security justified anything, even the violation of basic human dignity. The most haunting part? The victims often had no idea what had been done to them. They weren't enemies. They were patients, students, citizens. If memory can be altered, how do we trust our own past? And if governments are willing to erase minds to protect secrets, how many of those secrets are still buried inside records or inside people? The legacy of MK-Ultra is not just the damage it caused, but the chilling reminder of how easily ethics can be set aside when power wears a white coat and speaks the language of research. What happens when the pursuit of control forgets the value of a single, unbroken mind? A knock at the door, a letter with no return address, a whisper in the crowd that turns into silence. For 15 years, these were the tools of a government program aimed not at foreign enemies, but at its own citizens. The operation had a name, COINTELPRO. From 1956 to 1971, the FBI ran an extensive domestic surveillance and disruption campaign targeting American activists. Their crime? Dissent. Civil rights leaders, anti-war organizers, indigenous advocates, student protesters, even artists and clergy, all fell under suspicion. Anyone who challenged the status quo was marked as a threat, not for violence, but for their ideas. The mission wasn't to gather intelligence, it was to neutralize. Agents infiltrated meetings, forged letters, and spread rumors designed to fracture trust within movements. They pushed activists toward paranoia, framed them for crimes, and in some cases incited violence they could then use to justify arrests. The Black Panther Party became a prime target. Their community programs, like free medical clinics and breakfast for children, gained public support, and that made them dangerous. The FBI responded with force. In one case, they provided police with a detailed map of a Panther leader's apartment and ensured he was drugged the night before a raid. He was shot in his bed while asleep. Elsewhere, agents sent anonymous letters to civil rights leaders threatening exposure, humiliation, and even suggesting suicide. One infamous note was sent just weeks before a Nobel Peace Prize ceremony. It ended with a chilling line, "You know what you have to do." These were not isolated incidents. They were coordinated operations, signed off at the highest levels. So how did the truth come out? Not through confession, through theft. In 1971, a group of activists broke into a small FBI field office in Pennsylvania. They weren't looking for secrets, they were looking for proof. What they found stunned even them, hundreds of documents detailing the FBI's war on dissent. Those files made their way to journalists. The government could no longer deny what had happened. Officially, COINTELPRO ended that year, but its fingerprints remained. Later decades saw new programs under new names, still targeting political opponents, still operating in the shadows. After 9/11, similar tactics were used against peace activists, environmental groups, and even teachers' unions. No agent was ever prosecuted. No leader held accountable. The legacy of COINTELPRO is still with us, not only in the mistrust it sowed, but in the historical gaps it left behind. Movements that might have flourished were instead fractured. Voices that could have changed history were silenced. And we're left with a hard truth. In a democracy, it's not just the ballot that shapes the future. It's the stories we're allowed to tell, the alliances we're allowed to form, the fears we're taught to carry. If patriotism means obedience, what room remains for progress? And if the guardians of liberty see freedom itself as a threat, who will protect us from the protectors? There are photographs locked away in government archives, faded, silent witnesses to something too cruel to be fiction. Between 1946 and 1948, under the banner of public health and scientific advancement, American researchers deliberately infected nearly 1,500 Guatemalan men, women, and children with syphilis and gonorrhea. They did it without consent, often without the victims even knowing. The victims included prisoners, soldiers, sex workers, and psychiatric patients. Some were injected directly. Others were deliberately wounded, so bacteria could be applied to their open flesh. And when the disease took hold, painfully, visibly, they were often left untreated. Why? To study how fast the infections progressed, to track their effects, to test antibiotics, not to heal, but to observe. These weren't rogue experiments. They were funded by the U.S. government, approved by top officials. The lead doctor had already overseen another infamous study in Tuskegee, where Black American men with syphilis were allowed to suffer untreated for decades. When scrutiny in the U.S. threatened his work, he moved the operation to Guatemala, where the oversight was weaker, the laws more flexible, and the victims even more invisible. The timing is especially jarring. These experiments began just months after the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi doctors were prosecuted for non-consensual human experimentation. As international codes of medical ethics were being drafted, American doctors were violating them. And for over 60 years, no one knew. The truth surfaced by accident. In 2005, a professor researching the Tuskegee study stumbled on files buried in an archive. They contained photos, letters, detailed notes, the entire blueprint of the Guatemalan experiments. The evidence was undeniable. In 2010, the U.S. issued a formal apology, but it came with no criminal charges, no compensation, and no official admission of wrongdoing beyond regret. Survivors received nothing. The Guatemalan government filed a lawsuit. A U.S. court dismissed it, citing sovereign immunity. The people behind the experiments were never held accountable. Many went on to long careers in medicine and academia. Some were celebrated as pioneers. The system that allowed it, the classification policies, the diplomatic immunity, the culture of secrecy, remains intact. So what do we do with this knowledge? History, we like to believe, is a lesson, a warning. But sometimes it's a mirror. And in that mirror we see not only the cruelty of the past, but the mechanisms that let it continue. When science loses its soul, when governments trade ethics for data, the cost isn't measured in statistics. It's measured in suffering that has no name, no face, and for decades, no memory. And when the victims are silenced, who speaks for them? Who records the pain that was never supposed to be known? The shot rang out just after 6 p.m., echoing off the stone and glass of a Memphis street. It was April 4th, 1968. A civil rights leader stood on the balcony of his motel, a man whose voice had become the soundtrack of a nation's conscience. Moments later, he lay dying. The official story is simple. A lone gunman fired from a nearby boarding house window, fled the scene, and was later caught. But the truth, like his dream, was far more complicated. What followed the assassination was not just mourning, it was a tightening of silence. Declassified FBI files reveal years of harassment aimed at discrediting and destabilizing this leader. He was under constant surveillance. His hotel rooms bugged. His associates intimidated. Anonymous letters, laced with threats and moral condemnation, arrived in the mail, one even implying he should end his own life. As his voice grew bolder, condemning the Vietnam War, calling for economic justice, the pressure intensified. He had begun organizing a nationwide poor people's campaign, demanding fundamental changes to America's economic structure. And that made him, in the eyes of the powerful, a radical. In 1999, over 30 years later, a civil court in Memphis quietly heard new evidence. 70 witnesses testified over 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for just hours before delivering a stunning verdict. Government agencies had been complicit in a conspiracy to assassinate him. It wasn't front-page news. Few media outlets covered it. The trial was not a criminal proceeding. It couldn't result in jail time, but its implications were seismic. Witnesses described unusual government activity in the city before the shooting. A restaurant owner confessed he had been paid to provide access to the boarding house. Military intelligence units were confirmed to be conducting surveillance that day. And perhaps most troubling, local police were pulled back from their usual posts just hours before the assassination. Even the forensic evidence didn't hold up. Ballistic tests were inconclusive. Some heard shots from a direction inconsistent with the alleged sniper's position. The convicted gunman immediately recanted, claiming he had been set up, and he maintained that claim until his death. The family of the fallen leader didn't just believe him. They publicly embraced his plea for a new investigation, but no full federal inquiry ever came. The government maintained its original narrative, and history, printed in textbooks and spoken at ceremonies, moved on. What does it mean when the story we're told doesn't match the story we find? If truth can be buried under bureaucracy, if justice can be avoided through technicality, what hope remains for accountability? He once said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But bending takes pressure, and maybe the most honest tribute we can offer is not a statue or a holiday, but a willingness to keep asking the questions he didn't live to answer." No one volunteered. Between 1944 and 1974, thousands of American citizens were exposed to radiation, intentionally, covertly, and without their consent. These weren't battlefield accidents or rogue trials. They were part of a government-sanctioned program aimed at understanding the human effects of nuclear exposure. The settings were disturbingly ordinary: hospitals, universities, schools, even state institutions for the mentally disabled. The victims? Terminally ill patients. pregnant women, prisoners, children, all seen as expendable, all chosen precisely because no one would believe them or ask on their behalf. At a state institution in Massachusetts, mentally disabled boys were fed radioactive oatmeal as part of a so-called nutrition study. They were told they were joining a science club. The consent forms given to parents never mentioned radiation. In hospitals, patients were injected with plutonium without their knowledge. Doctors monitored their organs to see how the radioactive particles spread. Some patients died. Others lived unaware of what had been done to them. At a university, over 800 pregnant women were given a vitamin drink laced with radioactive iron. The goal? To see how it crossed the placenta. The results were published. The truth was not. Even more horrifying were the prison experiments. Inmates were paid to undergo testicular radiation. Later, many developed cancer. They were never told why. The rationale behind these acts was always the same: national defense. The Cold War justified everything. Researchers claimed they needed data to protect soldiers or improve safety protocols for atomic workers. But the ethics, already codified after World War II, were ignored. For decades, the records remained sealed. Journal articles discussed the findings, but never the methods. Consent forms were forged or destroyed. Survivors were silenced by shame, confusion, or early death. Then, in the 1990s, a few reporters began digging. A government review was ordered. Over 4,000 experiments were identified. In 1995, a presidential commission confirmed what many had feared. These weren't isolated incidents. They were systemic. The government issued a formal apology. Some victims received financial settlements, but many never did. No researchers were prosecuted. The institutions involved continued operating, often without acknowledging their roles. What makes these experiments so haunting isn't just their cruelty, it's the betrayal. The people subjected to them believed they were receiving care. They trusted the white coats, the clipboards, the quiet nods of reassurance. Instead, they became data points. When we talk about history, we often imagine progress as a straight line, but these experiments reveal something else: a recurring willingness to trade human rights for perceived security. How many scientific breakthroughs carry silent costs? And if we only uncover these truths decades later, after apologies are easy and accountability impossible, what does that say about the knowledge we take for granted today? In a nation that once prosecuted doctors for crimes against humanity, we must confront this truth. The same crimes were committed here, quietly, legally, systematically. And most of us never knew. Imagine discovering that a war your country fought, a war that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, was built on a lie, then buried under layers of silence. Between 1899 and 1902, the United States fought the Philippine-American War, a brutal conflict that officially doesn't feel like a war in most American classrooms. It was framed as a peacekeeping mission, a civilizing effort. In reality, it was a bloody imperial campaign to crush a people's fight for independence. The U.S. had just defeated Spain and taken possession of the Philippines. But when Filipino revolutionaries, who had already declared independence, resisted American control, the war began. What followed was not noble conquest, it was massacre. Entire villages were burned. Civilians were slaughtered. A general famously ordered his troops to kill everyone over the age of 10, describing his goal as turning the island into a howling wilderness. Soldiers used a form of torture known as the water cure, forcing detainees to drink gallons of water, then beating it out of them. Survivors described it as a slow drowning on dry land. Reconcentration camps were established, separating civilians from fighters. Conditions were horrific. Starvation, disease, and neglect killed thousands. Estimates of civilian deaths range from 200,000 to over 1 million. And yet, this war remains almost invisible in American memory. Why? Because the truth was inconvenient. Newspaper editors who reported on atrocities were labeled traitors. The government framed critics as unpatriotic. Military trials were held for officers accused of war crimes, but most were quietly acquitted or given token punishments. The educational system followed suit. Textbooks called it an insurrection. The occupation was described as peaceful. The brutality erased. But the records never vanished. Letters from soldiers, military reports, eyewitness testimonies. They all tell the same story. A systematic campaign of terror cloaked in the language of civilization. And perhaps more disturbingly, the war became a template. Strategies first used in the Philippines, torture, civilian containment, targeted village destruction, would reappear decades later in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The ghosts of this conflict didn't stay buried. They evolved. In the Philippines, the war is remembered. It's taught in schools, memorialized in monuments. But in the U.S., it lives in the margins, an uncomfortable footnote in the rise of a global power. What does it say about a nation when it forgets the wars it started? When the victims of its expansion are stripped of voice and memory? History, we like to think, is shaped by ideals, but more often it is shaped by omission. And if we've been taught to forget a war that lasted 3 years, spanned an ocean, and reshaped global politics, what else have we accepted as truth simply because it was the only version offered? Sometimes history isn't hidden, it's just ignored long enough that it stops feeling real. It started with breakfast. Not weapons, not speeches, just warm meals served to children before school. Eggs, toast, milk, volunteers rising before dawn. No forms, no questions, just food. By the end of 1969, the Free Breakfast for Children program had spread to 45 cities across the United States. Tens of thousands of kids, many living in poverty, were fed every morning by a revolutionary organization whose message was simple: dignity begins with a full stomach. Teachers saw the difference immediately. Children focused more, fought less, smiled more. Health officials praised the program. Even some local officials supported it. But at FBI headquarters, it was labeled a threat. Not because of violence, not because of crime, because it worked. In internal memos, the program was called the greatest threat to internal security of the United States. Feeding children, they feared, was a gateway to community empowerment. It showed that the people society feared most could solve problems government programs ignored. The FBI's response was swift and methodical. They targeted the kitchens, the churches hosting them, the families who brought their kids. Health departments received anonymous tips warning of food safety violations. Raids were timed for maximum impact during breakfast hours when children were seated mid-bite. Food was confiscated or destroyed. Volunteers were arrested. Kitchens vandalized. In Baltimore, food was poisoned. In Chicago, a raid shattered dishes and terrified preschoolers. In San Francisco, suppliers were pressured to pull support. In letters to pastors, agents warned of violent radicals serving food on sacred grounds. Many churches backed away. Parents who brought their children were questioned by police, sometimes at home, sometimes at work. The message was clear. Your participation puts you under watch. The goal wasn't disruption. It was deterrence, and it worked. Under pressure, donations dried up. Volunteers burned out. Chapters closed. The program that had fed tens of thousands began to vanish. What remained was the narrative that those who tried to help were dangerous. That revolution wore the face of a breakfast line. Years later, the documents surfaced. The raids, the memos, the sabotage. All real, all deliberate. But by then the kitchens were gone. The federal government eventually launched its own school breakfast initiative, inspired, ironically, by the very program it had tried to destroy. But the original message, the community-driven, justice-rooted, radical compassion, was diluted. We often imagine resistance as violent, but sometimes it's an act of care. A hand over a stove, a bowl placed in front of a hungry child. So what does it mean when a nation views feeding its children as subversive? And what kind of fear must a system feel to believe that breakfast is a threat to its stability? In the end, it wasn't just food that was taken. It was trust, hope, and a model of how ordinary people, without power or wealth, could still nourish a future. All it took to end it was fear, and the quiet force of a pen behind a desk, signing a memo that said, "Stop them, whatever it takes." Some stories aren't erased all at once. They're buried layer by layer until even the questions disappear. For years, the idea that America's top generals would plan terrorist attacks on U.S. soil seemed absurd, just as it seemed implausible that government scientists would inject citizens with plutonium, or that a secret war would rage in the Philippines with entire villages burned to ash. And yet, these events weren't myths. They were documented, verified, hidden only by the silence that followed. What ties them together isn't just the horror, it's the architecture of forgetting. The classification systems, the destroyed records, the quiet redactions in textbooks, the disinformation campaigns, the academic neglect, the newsrooms that chose not to follow up. Each story alone is shocking. But together they form a mosaic of institutional amnesia. And in that silence, something dangerous takes root. The belief that these were anomalies, that they couldn't happen again. But the mechanisms, the playbook, remain. The power to suppress, the incentive to protect reputation over truth, the legal shields that insulate institutions from consequence. In many of these stories, the only reason we know what happened is because of an accident, a misfiled document, a forgotten transcript, a whistleblower who chose not to stay silent. In every case, the truth surfaced not because the system worked, but because it cracked. So what about the stories that never slipped through? What about the operations that left no surviving paper trail? What else have we accepted as historical truth simply because the alternatives were erased before they could be considered? It's tempting to believe we live in an age of transparency, that the internet makes secrets harder to keep, but information isn't the same as access. Documents may be declassified, but buried in archives no one visits. Digital files can be locked behind paywalls or algorithmically hidden, and memory is fragile. As survivors age, as witnesses pass, as journalists move on, the past becomes a blur, replaced not with denial, but with quiet disinterest. What we call history is often just the version that survived long enough to be retold. So how do we protect the truth? By questioning more, by listening longer, by refusing to accept the first answer, or the official one, as the whole story. Because every document we've explored in this journey, every hidden file, every sworn testimony, every erased headline points to a single conclusion. The most dangerous secrets are not the ones we find. They're the ones we never think to look for. The past isn't past. It's hidden in plain sight, tucked into file boxes, stitched into faded photographs, whispered across generations who were told to forget. But forgetting was never the end. It was a beginning. These stories, of coups averted, massacres erased, experiments concealed, aren't just about what was done. They're about who was silenced and who decided what should be remembered. There's a strange comfort in thinking history is finished, that the dark chapters have been closed, the lessons learned, the sins buried. But history doesn't live in archives. It breathes through culture, through systems, through the assumptions we carry without question. A country that poisoned its own children's food. A military that proposed killing civilians for strategic optics. Scientists who chose suffering over consent. We like to believe these were missteps, aberrations in an otherwise noble arc. But that arc was shaped by what was hidden, not just what was done. Each story we've told reveals not just a moment of injustice, but a pattern. Those in power, when left unchecked, will shape reality to serve their interests, and those without power will bear the cost. So where does that leave us? Not in despair, but in responsibility. To remember is an act of resistance. To question is an act of preservation. To speak about what was silenced is an act of restoration. Because truth isn't always loud. Sometimes it flickers in a survivor's voice, in a rediscovered letter, in a scar that never made it into the records. And the future depends on whether we choose to listen. There is still so much we don't know, so much we weren't taught. But every truth recovered, no matter how late, pushes back against the tide of forgetting. History is not what happened. It's what we say happened. And now we say this, that dignity matters more than doctrine, that silence is never neutral. That memory is the first step toward justice. Not every lie will be uncovered, not every victim will be named. But the act of trying, that matters. And as long as we're willing to dig, to doubt, to hold power accountable, the truth will not stay buried forever. The record closes where the silence began. We began this journey not to rewrite history, but to uncover the pages that were never allowed to be written. Pages scorched by fear, folded under pressure, or tucked away under lock and key. Now, as we return to the present, the question that remains is not just what happened, but what we do with the knowing. Because knowing changes us. We've walked through stories of erased rebellions, hidden atrocities, and buried truths. And we've seen that history is not just about facts, it's about power, about who gets to define reality and who is told their memories don't matter. The people we met along the way, truth-tellers, whistleblowers, survivors, didn't ask for the burden they carried, but they spoke. They remembered. They kept the flame alive in a world built to smother it, and we, the listeners, inherit that flame. It's tempting in the face of such darkness to look away, to retreat into the comfort of accepted narratives. But if we do that, we become part of the silence. We become the next layer of forgetting. Instead, we must treat history not as a monument, but as a mirror. We must ask, what truths are we missing now? What voices are being silenced today? What documents, classified or deleted, will surface long after we're gone? And what will they say about us? This is the work of remembrance. It's not about cynicism. It's about vigilance, empathy, humility. Because the past isn't a closed book. It's a living question. The question is, who are we when no one is watching? That is the thread running through every hidden story. Not just what governments did, but what people allowed. What systems protected, what societies tolerated to preserve comfort over truth. But this isn't where the story ends. Each of us carries a piece of the record, in what we read, what we teach, what we choose to repeat or challenge. Memory is not passive, it's an act, and it's one we make every day. So let us choose to remember, to look again, to listen when the world goes quiet. Because history is still being written, and it belongs to those who refuse to forget.